Are you filled with faith or are you filled with fear? Are you walking by faith or are you not walking because you're filled with fear? There was a time in my life I really struggled with fear. When I was 20 years old, God called me to plant a church from scratch with a team of people. So I didn't have a team of people. I didn't know where or when. So I began to pray every day. God would give me a time to go. I was only 20, a town to go to. I didn't know where to go. And God would give me a team of people to go with me. Well, as I was getting closer, God gave me a team of people to go with me, 4 other men and their families, a great wife to go with me. God gave me a time to go after I finished my master's degree, and God gave me what I thought was the town to go to. But I was from a small town, and the town God was leading me to had 1 million people. I was intimidated. Well, I took a trip to that town and went to the top of the biggest building in town and looked out over the city, and I just saw city spreading in every direction, and I was intimidated. I saw how big the city was, and I realized how small I was. I didn't even know anybody in that city that would have any interest in coming to a new church. I was intimidated. I was looking at the problem, the situation, and I was not looking at Jesus, at God, who's bigger than the situation. Well, that night, I was so anxious and worried and concerned. I got up from the dinner table and said, I'm going to take a walk, and I took a walk, and as I was walking, God began to speak to me. And it reminded me of the story of David and Goliath. Little David, a young teenager, and Goliath, the 9'6" giant, seasoned warrior who'd killed many, many men. Well, if David looked at Goliath, he would be intimidated and would be filled with fear. But he didn't. He realized that he wasn't big enough to defeat that giant, but that giant was nothing compared to God. God was infinitely bigger than Goliath, and it didn't matter how big David was, it mattered how big God was. And so he began to be filled with faith as he focused on God, and as you know, he defeated Goliath and brought about a great victory. And as I was thinking about that, God spoke to me and he said, stop looking at how small you are and how big the city is. Start looking at how big I am and how small the city is compared to me. Well, I left that situation, went back to finish my degree and my job before moving a year later to that city to start a church, and I made a commitment to grow my faith. I figured it's like a muscle, I could grow it. So the first thing I did is just honestly admit my unbelief. I said, God, I believe, help my unbelief. And I just admitted that in and of myself, I wasn't a person of faith. Then I listed a dozen scriptures about faith, and I memorized those scriptures, and every time doubt would come, I'd quote those scriptures to myself. Then I began to strengthen my prayer life because the scripture says in Mark 11, whatever you ask in my name, believe that you receive it and you will have it. And I began to pray by faith and began to see God answer as he provided for us to go plant this church. I made a new commitment to take time every morning, and as I was going to bed at night, to not focus on what I was worried about, but to worship God, put worry in the place of worship in the place of worry, and put Bible in the place of other things, and put faith in the place of fear. And then the last thing I did is I began to actively take steps of faith and began to ask God to provide money, ask people to provide things for this new church plant, and I took steps believing, without seeing, but believing that God was big enough to make this happen. Well, we moved to the city a year later. We started a church in my basement with 12 people. 20 years later, those 12 people had grown to over 2,000 people, and we planted 5 churches around the city. We planted 4 or 5 churches around the country, and God worked in an amazing way. But it never would have happened if I would have stayed focused on the giant, how big the city was, instead of focusing on the God who's bigger than the giant. That God's bigger than the city. And God, if God called me to reach it, God would use me to make a difference. I want to encourage you today. Some of you have been looking at the giants in your life, and God's telling you, get your eyes off your giant, put your eyes on me. I'm big enough. Trust me. Walk by faith.